populist revolt of the 1890s and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Of course, in each of these periods, poor and laboring class people came together, to push for social change. I'm going to just focus on the last one, the 1930s Depression. And even today, you'll hear people say, well, gee, what we need today is something like an FDR-type New Deal. Not quite. And the reason is the following. FDR's troika of support, his three legs of support, were the urban political machines, they were the trade unions, and they were the Dixiecrats, the same people who are in the Republican Party and Liberty, all these other things today. But they were very white supremacists, right? And so what happens, let me move it ahead. Allen found, when he looked at those three periods, the key to defeat of the forces was by, in each case, by appeals by the ruling class to white supremacism, basically by fostering white skin privileges. Here's the example of the Depression, a very important example. I come out of the labor movement. A fellow named Ira Katznelson has written a book, When Affirmative Action Was White. He basically argues each and every program, federal program, from the onset of Depression into the 1960s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. Look at the labor movement. The National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security until 1951 excluded, written into the law, domestic and agricultural workers. That's 80% of your black and Latin workforce, particularly down south. Designed this way, right? The labor legislation, I mentioned that. Federal relief monies, it was federal monies, but it was controlled locally. That meant down south there was extraordinary disparity in the dispersals of the monies. The last two are very important. I hope people hear these, think about them. One is the GI Bill. GI Bill, after World War II, people who served could get a house under the GI Bill, zero down payment, low interest loan. I live in the New York, New Jersey area. Statistics for New York, New Jersey, 67,000 GI loans awarded, less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the ring of lily white suburbs around New York and every other city in this country. Ruling class policy. Here's the last one I want to just point to today to reinforce what Alan's saying. The black to white unemployment differential. In 1929, at the start of the Great Depression, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1 to 1, which makes sense if you think about it, because black people brought here to labor, right? That's it. By 1947, after all those programs of the New Deal and the post-war redeployment, the black to white unemployment ratio was 2 to 1, and that's all it's been since any of us here in this room, I think, have been alive. Some close variation of that. All right. Now Allen, so he starts out looking at those three crises, but he had some deeper issues he wanted to look at too. Why is there a relatively low level of class consciousness in the U.S. and why no socialism? And he winds up looking at the six-pronged rationale that labor and left historians have put forth to explain this. But let me just say a little more. Compared to other advanced capitalist countries, this country never developed very progressive, significant socialist social party when Harrison thing took on some proportions, but nothing like what developed in, say, France or Germany or England or some of these countries where they actually vie for power at times, right? And a lot of commentators have commented on the relatively, not that there's not insurgents and fight and everything like that, but overall, and we see it today, we're confronted by it, right? So the six-pronged rationale, and he goes through, and this is from historians of the labor movement on the left. He has a list of names I can go into later if you want. But these were some of the arguments: early right to vote, the heterogeneity of the workforce, free land, safety valve, higher wages, social mobility, aristocracy of labor. Allen goes through each and every one. I'm going quick here. And he says each of them, when you look closely at them, they're all white skin privileges. They didn't apply to black people at all, And whatever the effect may be on thinking white workers, it cannot be the same on the black workers. He countered with his own theory that white supremacy was the main retardant of class consciousness in the U.S. He understands white privileges as a poison bait. Please think about that another minute, if people might want to think about it. And you know, it looks good, supposedly, right, to people, but it's not in their interest. It's not in their real interest at all. And he constantly encouraged, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity forever means privileges never. Privilege is a poison bait, like a shot of heroin. Two essential points about race privilege policy in this country. It's from bourgeoisie, really implements it, pushes it, and it is contrary to surface appearances, not in the interest, long or short term, of the European American workers. He also wrote a nice little essay on the most vulnerable point. In that essay, he argues that white supremacy is what they rely on to maintain social control. It's the key to what they rely on. But it's also their most vulnerable point, because if we can beat them on that issue, lots can unfold. A lot of the changes we'd like to see. And one other essay, he puts forth a little scenario just as a schema for thought. He says, in general, if we look back at the history of struggles in this country, there's been a 5-stage cycle. You know, as conditions begin to deteriorate under capitalism, the substance of the white workers' race privileges becomes somewhat drained. The white workers manifest a tendency to show some solidarity with their co-workers. Then the bourgeoisie moves to resubstantiate the racial privilege of the white workers. And unfortunately, historically, what has happened is the white workers have taken the poison bait, repudiated solidarity. So Allen, that's the 5-stage cycle, and Allen emphasizes, one second. He says it's very important, particularly in those stages when the people are coming together, right? When we start coming together, we're talking about we've got to do something, we've got to change this. We know what's coming. They're going to try and break us up, as we see today, by appeals to white supremacy and things like that. So we've got to beat him back. He's kind of, all right. So here's Allen when he's ready to write. So now, we're almost there. We're almost getting to the book. Everybody okay? We're all right? Okay. Now, he's ready to write. He's grappling with all these problems. But then what happens, a guy named Winthrop Jordan comes out with a book, 1968. Wins National Book Awards. Because this is the 60s. It's the era of the civil rights, black liberation struggle. And Jordan, who winds up down in Mississippi later on, he's up at Brown at the time, I think, he writes a book, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards a Negro. You can see by the title, he equates white with American, right? And what he says, in effect, is that that white supremacy is an unthinking decision. It's natural. That's basically what he's arguing in his book. He looks for all these examples. And Allen says, well, and he tries to focus on the colonial period. Allen goes, I got to take this argument on. I can't let this one slide. So that's what leads him to go back to the 17th century. When he goes back, he's clear two issues that he knows he has to take on. And these are the two main arguments, he would argue, I would argue, that undermine struggle against white supremacy by European American workers. One is the argument that racism is innate. Because if racism is innate, why fight it? Can't do anything about it. And the second argument, that white workers benefit. If the workers we're talking about, if they benefit, why should they oppose it? Fair question, right? All right, so the first one is associated with Winthrop Jordan. The second argument is associated with Edmund Morgan, who I mentioned before, who appears in Michelle Alexander's book. And Morgan does good work on the colonial period, but he argues that in Virginia, particularly in the 18th century, there were too few poor white to matter. That's not the case. That's the case in St. Croix, in Jamaica, but down south, the majority, you still got the majority in so many of these places, European American laborers, laboring people. So, here's volume 1. Here we go. Here's what Allen writes in the preface to volume 1, Food for Thought. I'm not white. You've seen this picture, right? He goes, I acknowledge my obligation to Charles Johnson, African American, William Carlisle, Italian American, who cleared it. I'm not white. That's what he writes in the acknowledgments. For Allen, and I elaborate on this, there was nothing positive in white race or in identifying in white. And in his personal and political life, he tried not to think or act white. The white race, he explained, is now and always nothing other than a bourgeois social control formation. He considered it a special obligation of European American worker to act by resigning from the white race, join the human race, if you will, and free of the incubus of white identity. He added that resigning does not entail entering this is not a Rachel Dolezal situation, right? No, this is serious. this, right? You know, he's really getting after this, right? And you're a European American, but you want to get away from that, right? You don't want to encourage it in anybody else, right? So in volume 1, it's a 2-volume work. The first one, he wants to hit the main thing he's writing is volume 2. It's how it develops in 17th century Virginia. But he's got to get there, and he's got to clear away some of the intellectual moorings. So to clear away what he calls the white blind spot. That's a phrase from Dubois, right? So in his introduction to volume 1, he reviews a lot of the historiography, the psychocultural school, and the socioeconomic. He's very much on the side of the socioeconomic. He has some issues with some things they've written, but he's very critical totally of the psychocultural approach. Of all the historians he reviews in this period, the one who he thinks really gets it best is Lerone Bennett Jr. If you're not familiar with Lerone Bennett Jr., Morehouse grad, he's senior editor of Ebony magazine for decades, right? And wrote some wonderful books. In this book, Shaping a Black America, he basically lays out the same 3 arguments that Allen is developing. Then Allen wants to look at race, look at some of the howling absurdities. Here's a few examples he uses. In colonial Latin America, it was possible for a person to purchase a royal certificate of whiteness. In Brazil, it was said money whitens. In the U.S., no such whitening occurred. 1890, Portuguese siblings settling in Guyana, British Guiana at that time, right, would learn that he or she was not white. But a sibling of that person arriving in the U.S. would learn that they were white. Same family, different place, right? Cuba, this is a good one, same country, 1907. In Cuba, in the last Spanish census, Mexican, Indians, and Chinese were classified as white. U.S. comes down and says, that's not the way we do it. And they're classified as colored, right? And then, of course, Virginia law, and people are probably familiar with much of this, but you have all these gyrations they go through, what defines a Negro, 1/4, 1/16, 1 drop. Again, people are familiar with all of that. So Allen says, in the face of all this, we've got to look a little more deeply, and we've got to look at the nature of the oppression. We've got to look at racial oppression as we would look at class oppression, gender oppression, things like this. Let's see what some of the characteristics of it are. And he focuses also not on why the bourgeoisie would turn to slavery, because he's very clear. He's a coal miner. He'd come up out of the mines to see that smiling face of the foreman, you know, after doing 10, 12. He knows they don't care about him, right? And in his book, he's going to, and I'm going to come to this, he'll talk about in England the English imposed slavery on English vagabonds, 1547 to 1550, or slavery on Scottish salt pan workers for almost two centuries, right? But the question is not why they would do it, because we know they would do it. They'll do what they can get away with. But how could they establish that degree of social control? So he analyzes racial oppression, and he considers in the course of this the phenotype argument, the skin color argument, to be the ace in the hole of the racist apologists, because they always say, oh, it's race, it's color, it's pigmentation, it's skin, right? So he goes through defining characteristics of racial oppression, declassing legislation, deprivation of civil rights, illegalization of literacy, displacement of family rights, and a hallmark is the reduction of all members of the racially oppressed group to status beneath that of others. That's what we saw in the Dred Scott decision, right? In order to break from the phenotype argument, he looks in the Irish mirror. He says, I'm going to take a look at Ireland. And what he finds is Irish history presents a case of racial, he actually calls it ratio-religious oppression, which is very similar to that's imposed on African Americans. And then you can't make this phenotype argument because the oppressor group is at least physically the same phenotype, the English and the Irish, right? So he does a comparative study, and he shows, I think rather convincingly in Volume 1, that racial oppression is not dependent on differences of phenotype. Essential elements of discrimination against the Irish in Ireland and African Americans: they destroy original forms of social identity, they exclude the oppressed group from admittance into the normal the forms of social identity. A key distinction, now he's talking about racial oppression, but he distinguishes that from national oppression. In national oppression, a sector of the oppressed group is promoted to help maintain control, right? In racial oppression, that's not what goes on. The oppressed group is not included in the social control formation. So he talks about Virginia as a system of racial oppression. In the Caribbean, in contrast, where Harrison's coming from, Garvey, he goes, it's national oppression because there's a promotion of that sector of the African descended population. And because there were too few laboring class Europeans to do it the other way. It's one of the main reasons. It's got to do with the nature of capitalist production, sugar plantation production. It's very capitalist intensive. But one statistic he cites in there, which is very interesting for people to think about, is on the eve of emancipation, slave emancipation in Jamaica in the 1830s, 23% of the enslaved population were owned by people of color. That shows the contrast between what we have here and there. That's one indicator. I mean, there's more to that. It's a more complex issue. But on the transition from racial, he also shows how you can move from racial to national oppression, how it's done in the Caribbean and in Ireland. And after the protests get big, they grant some power to the Irish Catholics, right? But in general, it's Protestant ascendant. They keep the Protestant ascendancy in Ulster and around there. He also talks about the sea change. Irish hate the British. He goes through in page after page the oppression of the Irish by the British, and they hate the British. They're supporters of abolition. They oppose slavery. Within 3 generations, Irish come to America and they become white. They oppose abolition. They support slavery. But it's not because it just comes to them automatically or anything. He goes through and discusses the role of the plantation elite and the related financial interests, the Catholic Church hierarchy, Tammany Hall. He goes systematically how these are ruling class people pushing this. And then he talks about how, we're ending volume 1, we're getting to volume 2 right now. Northern bourgeoisie opts for Reconstruction. After slavery, after the Civil War, slavery is abolished, theory. Northern bourgeoisie abandons Reconstruction after a short period of Reconstruction. And what they do is they settle on reconstituting, reestablishment of the social control system based on what the South had done before with the system of racial privileges. And they extend racial privileges in free land, immigration, industrial employment. The exodus, when black people tried to leave the South in 1879, is beat back brutally. They didn't have access to free land. And the cotton mill campaign down south, when the industry comes down south, it's slowly white, right? So what he has argued in volume 1 is essentially the same Anglo-bourgeoisie, these English bourgeoisie. Here's what he says they've done. They've imposed religio-racial oppression against Irish Catholics. They've imposed national oppression in the Anglo-Caribbean. They've imposed racial oppression in the Anglo-American continental colonies. And then racial oppression has been transformed into national oppression. See, these things are socially done, right? And so he goes, the same people who were victims of racial oppression in Ireland become white American defenders. Volume 2. This is it. This is the baby. All right. He turns to Jamestown. He's going to start and focus on 17th century Virginia, 1607 to 1750. He's focused on 3 key pivotal events, but there's much, much more in this volume. 1622, the reduction to chattel labor status of laboring people. I'm going to get into that. Bacon's Rebellion, and then the revisal of the laws in 1705 and then later in 1723. He goes through the English background and he points out what I mentioned previously, that in England they had imposed slavery on vagabonds between 1547 and 1550. It's their own people, so it didn't take skin color to enable them to do it. It got beat back by some class struggle. And in Scotland, they imposed on Scottish salt pan workers from the 1600s to the 1790s. England, what helps us understand what happens in the U.S. as opposed to elsewhere in the Americas is the following. All of these European colonizing powers, when they come to the Americas, they have issues that they've got to deal with. They've got to secure an adequate supply of labor, and they've got to establish a system of